good morning, LinkedIn. My name is Joel Bennett, and I'd like to welcome you to this episode of Practical Leadership, an opportunity for you to learn how to be a more effective leader and build leadership habits into your daily work. If you are tuning in live, I would really love it if you would say hello in the comments and tell us where you're tuning in from. It's a lot more fun when we know who's here and what you're up to. So feel free to jump in, and especially if you were here with us last week with Alyssa Burkus on how writing can help you lead change. I'd love for you to just to share what you've been practicing to improve your own communication or the way that you interact with change with your teams. So feel free to drop that in the comments as well. If you have not been here before, during these sessions, we try to tackle real life challenges and topics that leaders have, try to encourage you to apply what you're learning and provide you actionable steps to weave into your own leadership practices and the team culture you're trying to create. So I've asked leadership experts from around the world to join us to really provide their own perspectives and experience. I want you to hear from the best of the best. And so today I'm excited to hear and be joined by Ruby Brown-Herring, CEO of RBH Wellness Solutions. Ruby's focus is to help organizations create strategies that support mental health at work. And I'm so excited to have her here. So thanks for being with us, Ruby.
Thank you for having me, Joel. Glad to be here today.
Awesome. So our topic today is really focused on one thing, and that's the leader's role in team well-being. And I think over the last number of years, we've experienced the importance of this, whether it be through COVID and folks moving back and forth between work and home. We've obviously seen a round of layoffs here recently, or a number of rounds of layoffs here recently, and just other workplace stressors. And so I think it's incredibly important for us to have conversations about this topic and really provide leaders some tools, or at least some mindsets around the topic. So I'm excited to get Ruby's thoughts on that. And before we start, I just want to remind you we want this to be a conversation. Ruby and I are going to have a conversation, but we'd like you to be a part of it. So please drop your thoughts, your comments, your experience in the chat. We want to hear from you as well. And if you're watching this as a recording, we still want you to be active. So please use those comments and I'll respond to them as soon as we get off the session. So let's see who we've got here today. Errol from St. Louis. Errol, thanks for coming back. Alyssa, great to see you, Alyssa. Mike Jansen from Vermeer, right down the road in Pella, Iowa. Tyler in Des Moines, thanks for coming back, Tyler. Sarah in Knoxville, great to see you. James in Raleigh, North Carolina. Brent Galkey from Pella. Rachel from Pella. Man, I've got a little bit of a crew here today in the area. So fantastic to have a pretty good crowd already assembling. And with a group like this, I hope to see some really active comments coming through. So let's go ahead and get started. Ruby, as I mentioned, I think this is a topic that has been on a lot of our minds and for some of us, a lot of our hearts. And just thinking about how do we take care of our teams well? Why do you think for a leader who has a small team, a large team, why do you think that focus on team well-being is so important in the workplace today?
Oh, that's a really good question, Joel. I think one of the first things that comes to mind is it's the right thing to do, right? You know, the human element is behind all of the work that we do in the workplace. And so keeping that in the forefront. But when we look at it from the business perspective, teams and companies, the bottom line, is important. And so what we've seen in a lot of the research over the years is that for organizations that have a plan in place for supporting employee well-being, even down to that team level especially, we see increased performance, we see increased engagement, and we see increased retention. And I was in a session yesterday and we had this very conversation, and one of the participants said, reframing even retention, because we can retain people and they be kind of static, but how do we move to sustainability? And I love that. And so thinking about it from that perspective, performance, engagement, and retention / sustainability.
Yeah. And I think as I think about the teams that probably function best, especially around if we just want to focus on performance, I, I would surmise, I'd love to hear your opinion on it too. But if I'm healthy, physically healthy, mentally healthy, I feel like I've got a great team around me. It's just easier for me to perform well, right? When I'm not pushing back against all the different challenges or barriers or work is hard for a lot of
Yeah.
us, and so to have a good team and have people around us that support our well-being, I feel like that would make performance even easier. Am I on the right track?
You're absolutely on the right track. And so when we look at overall well-being, but also drilling it down to the area that I focus on a lot is that mental well-being. Well-being, especially mental well-being, is important to team functioning and dynamics. And so you're right on point with what you said. And it helps folks connect in a way, right, where they're all working in sync. And so when we think about team performance for leaders that really want to have teams that are high functioning and are performing in a in sync manner, focusing on that well being and kind of normalizing the conversation is an important part of that.
When you think about, and you work with a number of different companies on this topic, over the last 6 months, for example, when you get called into organizations who may be struggling with this topic or trying to improve kind of employee well-being and culture around that, what are some of the what's been the impetus for that? I mean, what types of dysfunction are they seeing in the workplace, or what are the other factors that may be contributing to a low level of employee well-being there?
Yeah. I think the impetus for a lot of the calls that I've gotten is because of COVID, like with what many of us are seeing, organizations are recognizing that their folks are just tired and they're not performing at their best. And then there also have been organizations that have reached out because of the great resignation and folks are leaving. Because what a lot of employees have decided and recognized over the last 3 years is that it is important for me to be in a space where I feel that I am valued as a person, not just because of the skills that I bring to the table. And so there are a lot of organizations that are starting to hear that and are starting to look strategically at how they can support their folks. In terms of, one of the challenges, if you will, for some organizations that have reached out, it's we want to check a box so that we can say, yes, we provided this information for our managers or for our team, and then we'll move on. And it's not a check a box situation because that human element is going to be there after that one-off session. And so having conversations and getting them to understand how we can plan strategically to approach this issue. It's more than a one-off training, and how do we start to bring in leadership, right, from top down and commitment from the bottom up, from those boots on the ground folks,
Yeah.
right, so that we can start to truly change the culture of the organization.
Yeah. I would say a number of organizations that I work with, when we get on this topic, one of the first things they'll point to is, hey, we've got an employee assistance program, which is fantastic. We've got, other resources. It's kind of like a portfolio approach, right?
Mm-hmm.
They can pick and choose.
Mm-hmm.
And I think those resources are important. So I'm not trying to downplay them at all. But what tends to be missing is that human element, right? That my manager, my team members, when you talk about Gallup, do I actually have somebody at work that cares about me?
Right.
And if I don't, having the EIP program is not necessarily going to help me get up day to day to come to work and be happy about it.
That's
and
it.
So I think I really love your focus there on, but how do we create the environment, the people environment, the team environment that's going to both engage people, retain people, and allow them to work at their best.
Yeah.
So go ahead.
No, one of the things I thought about as you were saying that, Joel, is, organizations, I think, are starting to see some that employees that, to your point, feel like they are truly cared for and they're not just seen as a number. Those are the folks that are going to be 110% committed. They're going to give it their all. And so it's important that, leaders, managers start to recognize, okay, how is this going to improve my overall team? Because if Ruby leaves because she doesn't feel supported in that way, and let's say I have a specialty that I bring to your team, how long is it going to take you to recruit another person at my skill level to get my position filled once I'm gone? Chances are, if you have a strategic plan in place to prevent me leaving, it's going to cost you less than trying to fill my position once I'm gone.
Yeah. And the ripple effect that we don't always think about is if Ruby leaves, and in the meantime, while I'm trying to find her position, everybody else has to pick up the slack.
Right.
Which means more stress, more
Absolutely.
challenges. So obviously the leader of those teams is going to be really important. What are some ways that a leader can support employee well-being with their own teams?
I think first and foremost, just normalizing the conversation, right? So we know that leaders are not trained necessarily to counsel their teammates, but you can be a listening ear. And so try to normalize the conversation so that if someone on your team is struggling, they're not going to feel that they won't be heard if they bring up the conversation with you. So normalizing conversation that, when we think about well-being and particularly mental health challenges, it is common, 1 in 5 adults, right? And so normalizing that conversation is one of the first things that I think is important. The other piece that I think too is when we're looking at that team perspective, because like you said, teammates are going to pay attention to how individuals are supported or not supported. So trying to promote that fairness and that respect in relationships, right? And so as a team lead, I may not have the best relationship. Not that it's a negative relationship, but let's say you and I are on the team and I'm your team lead. You feel comfortable talking to me, but I still may not be your quote unquote person.
Right.
And so helping you by normalizing that conversation, it allows you then to find another person on your team that you can reach out to have conversations when you're struggling. And then through that connection, they may be able to help you put a conversation together so that you can come to me as your team lead to talk about your needs.
Right. Yeah, there's a couple things swirling in my head around this. I think about, so Catherine Harrison was on the show a number of weeks ago. She's worked really hard in the music industry. She's got a background in the music industry to start to normalize these conversations around mental health, because there's an epidemic really of folks in the music industry, whether they be singers and musicians or roadies or all these kind of things, where mental health is a real struggle, and they, with that suicide. Just had a conversation with somebody in the construction industry, and they're doing a lot currently around making sure that people understand not just the resources that they have, but to normalize the conversation around this is an issue for everybody. So whether you're a person working behind a desk in an office, or you're a guy swinging a hammer, regardless of how tough you think you are, mental health is part of all of us, and we need to make sure that we're taking care of it. So I think normalizing that conversation, as you said, or just being willing to have the conversation can be huge. One of the other things, spoke to a leader, it's probably been a couple of months ago now, who just said, sometimes it's just good for me to be able to share what I'm struggling with. Right. And so normalizing the conversation isn't just about, oh, hey guys, it's okay to talk about it. It's actually talking about it, saying, man, over the last few weeks, I've really struggled with this, or I've just been really feeling tired and exhausted and depressed, and not so that misery loves company, but more of a, if I'm willing to share a little bit of that, maybe somebody else will do the same thing with me.
Yeah, that is so spot on, Joel. When we think about leaders and, how can I as a leader support my team? The thing that you just mentioned is one of the first things that I tell folks. You've got to be vulnerable as a team leader to role model, right, what you want from your employees. And so doing that very thing. And it's not, and I know it's challenging as a leader being vulnerable to say, I'm struggling too. But when folks on your teams know that, Joel is human just like me.
Mm-hmm.
And if he's willing to talk about it, then it's okay for me to talk about it. And I think that's we saw that at the beginning of the pandemic, right? Where we see a lot of leaders and CEOs, C-suite folks saying, yeah, I'm struggling. And we saw those conversations start to happen. And now that's kind of drifted off. And so um, along with that normalizing, you as a leader having that conversation. One quick example that comes to mind. Several years ago, well, at the beginning of the pandemic, I was working for a state organization here in North Carolina, and right at the beginning of the shutdown, and we were all just like, oh my goodness, how long are we going to be on these little squares? And we had a team meeting. It was a small team of us. There were four of us plus our team, our section chief. And we had our weekly meeting, and she said, how are y'all doing? Which is, a great intro and before staff meetings get started. And we all just kind of sat there and, just radio silence, because even though we had a great relationship with her, I know I was feeling this way. And I think some of my other colleagues mentioned this later. We were like, well, we don't want to say that we're struggling, because what is that going to mean? And so after a few seconds of awkward silence, she leaned in like this and said, I'm struggling. I miss the routine. I miss being in the office with y'all. And I know for me, and you could see it in other folks at that time, just the weight lifted off of their shoulder. And everybody then chimed in with the fact that they were struggling.
Yeah.
And so that normalizing the conversation and modeling it and being vulnerable, it's not saying you're not great as a manager. It's just saying you're human. And it brings us back to that human element.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. So what would that's a great first tip for us. What else, a couple other tips that you would give leaders, and I'll maybe even focus on new leaders, folks that are leading teams for the first time, that before were just kind of taking care of themselves. Now they're taking care of others. What are a couple more tips that you could give them to help improve employee well-being with their own teams?
Yeah, I think one thing too that folks can do, the example that I just gave, before meetings, yes, you have packed agendas, but just take 5 minutes or so at the beginning of the meeting to check in with folks and see where they are, right? And so let's say you open up with that question, how are y'all doing today? And if there's silence, like the example I just gave, then that's your opportunity as the new manager to share, how you're doing. And if you're struggling, share that. If there's something that you're celebrating, share that, and kind of breaking that ice for folks. And I think one other thing that comes to mind that I think is helpful, as we're talking about normalizing the conversation, being sure to communicate with your team that anything that is shared is not going to be used in a punitive way, right? Because I think that stigma is what prevents a lot of folks in the workplace from speaking up. And so as you're having these conversations, as you're checking in with your folks, being crystal clear in your communication that you're not going to use anything punitively that they share with you, right? But you want to be able to support them and connect them to resources. And I think that's one thing that a lot of folks miss, is not communicating clearly that, yeah, I want you to reach out to me, but know that I'm not going to use anything punitively against you that you share with me.
Yeah. I love that, because I do think one of the concerns, and I'm going to go back to some of the fields that I work in. So, I'm going to say tough guys and gals, the construction, the manufacturing, the field service people. It's the John Wayne persona, right? And so if the first time that they actually do share, like, hey, things haven't been great at home, or maybe they've had a death in the family and they're really struggling through that mourning process, for them to actually say it out loud, and then either their manager or somebody else uses it kind of against them, is a perfect recipe for it never happening again.
Absolutely.
And I think it's important for us as leaders to be able to set the stage for that. And even we may be thinking, oh, I'm not going to do that but actually, like you said, to say it, right? Hey, I really appreciate you sharing this with me. I'm going to keep that in mind as I try to do my best to support you. But that, I just want you to know that this isn't something I'm going to hold against you or use, as a weapon or a tool to manage you.
That oh my goodness, I love that you just really modeled that conversation, because that's the thing that I see with leaders the most where they struggle is, how do I even have the conversation? And it's not, you don't have to do anything fancy and grandiose. It's something as simple as you've validated and acknowledged that person's feelings. You shared that you were there to support them and that we would figure out a plan. And so, during the pandemic, we talked about giving ourselves grace, and folks have used that, and I love it. But oftentimes, I think we're at the point now where we use it as a crutch and an excuse not to continue the work. And so I was with the group yesterday, and one of the things that we talked about was give yourselves grace right? Yes, this is where we are, and this is what's happening, and your feelings are valid. And this is how I can support you. And these are ways that we can help still move the work forward, because the work still has to move, right? So we can give ourselves grace as we're coming up with a plan to move that work forward. And I think that's a challenge sometimes, or something that organizations and leaders miss, is not having that plan in place. And so we've got to be, whether you're new manager or seasoned manager, be intentional and trying to think forward. What if this happens? How am I going to handle it? So that in that moment, I'm not trying to, oh my goodness, let me figure it out.
Right.
So yeah, I appreciate you kind of modeling that conversation in that language, because that can be challenging for folks.
And I think that prep piece is important, and I'm kind of putting you on the spot, so I apologize, because we can, and if we don't have all of it, we can put it in the comments later. But okay. If I'm a leader and I'm already kind of uncomfortable or not very confident about having some of these conversations with people, I think one of the reasons is it's kind of the what if. Well, what if they say this, or what if they say that, and I don't feel equipped? Like you said, I'm not a counselor. Right. I don't feel equipped to be able to help them through that. What are some good kind of tools to have in their toolbox as far as resources they could point people to beyond maybe what's offered by their organization, like an EAP?
Yeah. That's a really good question. I think, one of the things that I often suggest with some of my clients to think about is, there is a training that's called Mental Health First Aid, and it actually trains folks to have those difficult conversations. And so even if an organization can't commit to training folks in that national certification, what can you do in terms of some of the own manager trainings that you provide within your organization? So starting to create trainings for your managers in-house that helps them navigate those conversations. And so that may be a great opportunity to partner with your EAP program, not to necessarily just use one of their canned programs that they already have on the shelf, but developing something that's specific to your organization and your managers and your supervisors.
Yeah.
Because it shouldn't fall on HR's shoulders either, right? And so thinking about how they can train managers, whether it's working with EAP to develop something internally, or bring in someone to train their leaders in mental health first aid, because with that particular training, they spend a lot of time practicing those skills or having those conversations. They have scenarios that they follow throughout the training where folks are in small groups putting together those conversations and starting to develop that confidence, so that when they leave that training, they feel a little bit more comfortable putting together conversations in the workplace.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the tips that came out of a conversation I actually had here on LinkedIn from somebody in the industry, somebody in the construction industry, excuse me, that just said, that what they're starting to do is to give all of their crew leads, it's a business card. It has a number of different resources on it. It does have the EAP program. It has their health and wellness provider information on it. It has the National Suicide Line, some information about addiction and support, just to have it so that if somebody says, hey, I'm really struggling with this, or you notice that somebody's struggling, that you at least have the information. Now, that doesn't always make the conversation easier, but at least you don't feel like you have to be like, oh, I don't know what you're going to do about that. That you can say, hey, here are a few resources, and be able to direct them in that way.
I love that, because even thinking about the suicide prevention lifeline or the crisis text line, here's I think the comforting thing behind those two resources in particular. If I, as a team lead, have an employee that may be experiencing a mental health crisis, or not in crisis but are struggling, you don't have to be in crisis to use those resources. And so I could then pick up the phone and call 988 and say, hey, I've got a teammate here This is what they're experiencing. And then we connect them to that professional support. And so it takes some of that pressure off of me as the manager of, oh my goodness, I don't know what to say, but I can dial 3 numbers and sit with you, right? While the professionals on these crisis support lines are having the conversation with my teammate.
Yeah. And you said that's 988?
Yes, 988 is the new shortened version for the Suicide Prevention Lifeline. And then there's a crisis text line that's 741-741.
Okay.
And folks can type, send the letters help or MHFA. Either one of those 2 words are fine. And then you will be automatically connected to a crisis support specialist.
Fantastic. I'm glad you shared that, because I think that's one of the things that it's just good for us all to have kind of a simple resource or simple way of remembering how to get the help that people need when they need it.
Right. Yeah.
Well, I'm looking at our time. We're wrapping up here, but what's one simple step? Somebody watching today who's like, yep, this is important. I want to make sure that I'm supporting my team in a better way. What's one simple step that they could start practicing even today to take this up a notch for them?
Oh, I think the first step would be checking in with your folks to see how they're doing and role modeling the behaviors that you want to see in them. Be vulnerable, right? Letting them know that you're human too, and that you care about the human element that they are, and what they bring to the team.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Being human is a good start, right?
Yeah,
we're all people, and people don't. I always say people don't really respect perfect leaders. They respect perfect people. And perfect people aren't perfect. They're just people, right?
Right. That's it.
And so be a person. That's maybe one of the dumber things I've said today, but just be human, right? And act like you understand what it's like to be human and make mistakes and feel bad and feel great and all those other things that go with it.
Absolutely. I agree with you 100%.
Well, obviously LinkedIn can be used for a lot of things, and I'm excited that a number of you joined us today to watch this, to be part of the discussion. We've had some good reinforcement in the chat about, leaders starting this conversation and not using, some of the things that we hear or experience with other people punitively, and just taking the time to get to know their people and invest in them. What I'm going to ask, you've invested the time, you wanted to learn more about, your role in team well-being. I just want to make sure that investment you've made is not wasted. And so I'm going to ask you to be a little bit vulnerable, to role model this for others, and just identify what's one thing that you can commit to doing over the next 7 days to take your leadership in this area to the next level. How do you want to support your team? What are you going to be focused in on over the next week to make sure that nobody slips through the cracks? So once you have that, go ahead and drop it in the comments. And then if you come back next week, we'd love to hear how things went for you. So go ahead, take a few seconds now, drop that in the comments, and we'll get a chance to review those before we end the session today. I want to thank you, Ruby, for being part of this. I think it's a critically important topic, especially with everything that's going on in the workplace today. And I really appreciate your wisdom and experience.
Thank you for having me, Joel. I've enjoyed the conversation.
If you want to get a hold of Ruby to hear more about her work, I'd encourage you to reach out to her on LinkedIn and follow her posts. She does a nice job of interacting, engaging with people, and she'd be a fantastic resource if this is something you want to delve into in your workplace. So that brings us to next week. I'm excited to announce that Ellen Feldman-Ornato will be joining me from the Boulder Company. And we're going to talk about how we lead across generational differences. So keep your eyes out for that LinkedIn posting. Drop a note in the comments if you'd like, and I'll make sure that I invite you personally if you're concerned you're going to miss it. And again, I just want to encourage you, if you join us next Wednesday, if you know of other people that may get some value out of this session around generations, invite them, encourage them to be part of it. Or if they aren't able to do it live, the recordings are always available. But again, I want to encourage you to take something that you heard today and to put it into practice, even as soon as today, so that you can be the leader that your team needs from you right now. And if you've stumbled upon this video and we're not connected on LinkedIn, send me a connection request and mention the show, and we'll remedy that. But regardless, I just want to thank you for being here today. I want also to encourage you all, if you are struggling with your own mental well-being, to reach out, talk to your leaders, talk to your organization, any of the resources that you have around you, so that you can get the help and support that you may need. So I hope to see you again next week. But in the meantime, blessings.